What happened last night in Israel was not a defensive action of Iran. It was a calculated attack on a civilian population. Israel will not stand by in the face of such aggression. Israel will respond. Our response will be decisive. And yes, it will be painful.
Decisive and painful. Israel vows that they will respond to what happened yesterday with those that huge missile barrage from Iran into Israel, and it's going to be decisive. And I'm sorry, but whatever he thinks, he's wrong. It will not be decisive. It will just be the next step up the escalation ladder. And to discuss this and many more things about this ongoing war and now expanding war is Colonel Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat veteran, and definitely friend of the show. Doug, welcome back.
Yeah, happy to be with you, Dan.
But listen, let's just start off here. Let's look at a little bit at what the ambassador said there, because he's characterizing this as not a defensive move by Iran. Basically, it's an unprovoked attack, which I heard on a lot of Western media talking about this. What do you say to that aspect, first of all?
Well, anybody who attacks the Israeli Defense Force or Israel is obviously unprovoked. And anything the Israelis do is inevitably defensive. So let's get that straight. As long as we understand those terms of discussion, then we can move forward, right? The truth is that this was the long-awaited counterstroke from Iran that people thought would happen weeks ago, maybe months ago. It finally did. And the truth is, it wasn't especially impressive. The whole point of the strike seems to have been to demonstrate to the Israelis the precision strike capability of the Iranians. They did not deliberately attack any civilian area. I think only one Israeli citizen was killed. Not sure how that happened. But when you look at the 180 missiles that were fired, most of them were medium-range ballistic missiles. Most were not hypersonic. They were subsonic. This was not a particularly devastating attack at all. But they did use hypersonic missiles, and they did attack a number of targets in Israel that were designed to tell the Israelis, look, we know where you've got your capabilities. We know where you are, and we can strike at will. Now, this is in line with what I think is the advice that Putin and also President Xi in China are giving to the Iranians, which is restrain yourselves, don't overreact. And I think with this new government in Tehran, which is actually quite moderate, it is taking the position that there is an opportunity here to essentially move past the conflict. And I think they're wrong. I think that they failed miserably to understand that the Israelis are waging a ruthless war of extermination against their enemies. They've done that in against Hamas and effectively the population of Gaza. They're doing something on a much lower scale and less intensity in the West Bank at the moment, and they're prepared to do that in southern Lebanon. So I don't understand why they are quite as restrained as they are, but they really were. Remember, compare this with the deaths of 7,000 Lebanese after Israeli airstrikes over the last few days. Quite a contrast. One dies in Israel and 7,000 people are killed in Lebanon. This is not going to continue. I think at some point the Israelis are going to be made to pay a terrible price. And there is some indication that that has, in fact, begun on the ground in southern Lebanon.
Yeah, in fact, one of my sources had told me that Russia was, in fact, saying, hey, just cool the jets to Iran and just keep absorbing this and move until, especially after the BRICS summit. And apparently, originally, they had some agreement with that. But then the Russian prime minister actually went to Tehran and apparently was told, we can't wait any longer. We're not going to. And then we saw what happened there. Now, the big question now is what's going to happen next, because the president of Iran and their defense minister, barely minutes after the end of the missile barrage, came out and said, we're done. That we've answered the things that you've done to us. We don't want to carry this war any further. But if you do, understand that, to the point you literally just made, this was a small corner, to quote the Iranian president, of what we have. And the defense minister said we could use a lot more and a lot better of the missiles that we have if you do anything further. And then we had Netanyahu said this.
Tonight, Iran again attacked Israel with hundreds of missiles. This attack failed. Iran made a big mistake tonight, and it will pay for it. The regime in Iran does not understand our determination to defend ourselves and our determination to retaliate against our enemies.
So when you've heard some of the other statements, you saw that from the ambassador a minute ago, and Yoav Gallant was also said that there's going to be a severe retaliation. What do you think Israel is going to do next based on this? And actually, I have a second question after that, but let's answer that one first.
Well, let's recount very briefly what Prime Minister Netanyahu has said repeatedly when he talked about effectively settling accounts with all of Israel's current or historic enemies. Number one, we're going to destroy Hamas, and ultimately we're going to remove, either drive out or kill, the population of Gaza. Now, that objective has not been achieved, but that objective remains. That's number one. Number two, the West Bank has to undergo something similar. We want to push all of the Arabs on the West Bank into Jordan or into another neighboring Arab state, or if necessary, we'll kill them. He's effectively said that. His cabinet is behind that. And all you have to do is look at the numbers of people who've been killed or imprisoned in the West Bank to understand what's happening there. Then he has said, we are going to move into southern Lebanon, and we're going to clear all the way up to the Litani River, if necessary, in order to ensure that that territory is no longer hostile to us. We'll set up a new government of people who are predisposed to cooperate with us, or we'll just kill them. And then finally, you have the other thing, which is the rest of Lebanon. If we have to go through the rest of Lebanon, we have to pulverize it, reduce it to ashes, whatever, we will do that. Now, don't lose sight of the fact that there's this place called Iran. And Iran, if it dares intervene in this process to help or assist anyone, and we know that they've helped Hezbollah and that we know that they've given assistance to Hamas, we will destroy Iran. And he hasn't forgotten the Houthis, and he hasn't forgotten the Shiite militias operating in Iraq or Syria. So this is where he's headed, and it's underway. And the Iranian attack was ineffective strategically because it did nothing to dissuade the Israelis from this course. In fact, if anything, it convinced them to continue on this course. We, in the meantime, are standing in the background because we are awaiting that event that will eventually occur where the Israelis sustain heavy losses, either in the air or on the ground or both. And we have to intervene in order to rescue the Israelis from overreaching. I think that's the way the scenario is supposed to play out. Now, we are already involved today with Army, Air Force, Naval Special Operations, ISR capabilities. We are helping the Israelis target and lays targets in Lebanon. The death of Nasrallah and the other members would not have been possible had it not been for us and our enabling information and contributions. So our abilities to influence the conduct of operations is huge. And without it, the Israelis could not make the progress they've made thus far. They know that, and they want to keep on doing it as long as they possibly can, for fear that at some point we might say that's enough. Yeah. I don't think we're even close to that, but that's what I think is driving them.
Yeah, and before I ask you what you think that they will do next, like this current retaliation, I want to show you what former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said to Wolf Blitzer. And I want you to notice as you watch this that Blitzer hears what he's saying. He's like, hang on, let me clarify. Is this what I hear? And watch how this goes.
This is a once in a 50-year opportunity. What Israel needs to do immediately, we need to take out Iran's nuclear program. We need to attack Iran's energy facilities, and we need to attack the regime itself right away, because Iran made a fatal mistake of shooting 200 ballistic missiles at the state of Israel. Enough is enough, people.
Well, I just want to be precise, Prime Minister. You want Israeli airstrikes to blow up Iran's nuclear facilities and its energy facilities, all the oil wells and the oil-related industry that is the main part of the Iranian economy.
That's correct.
Wow. No shame or embarrassment or blushing involved here. So do you think that that's the next thing on the Israeli target list that would come potentially even as early as tonight in Israel?
Yes. And he's not saying anything that has not been said before. The Israelis have made it clear that if they were attacked in any way by Iran, that the first thing on their agenda was to destroy the oil production facilities. So they will be attacked. Now, that's very important. Let's step away from the nuclear facility issue right now. That's very important because it has a huge impact in Northeast Asia. And the Chinese in particular are very concerned about that. And they have made it clear that they will stand by Iran in the event that this occurs. There are forces in Iran who've said, if the Israelis do this, we will not hesitate to destroy all the oil facilities or production facilities that remain in the region. In other words, they're turning now on the Emirates and Saudi Arabia in particular. What they would say in the Muslim world is the fat and the corrupt in far off places who are wealthy. They are going to pay a price for their failure to join in the fight against Israel. So this is a very dangerous path that they're on, but it's going to bring on the regional war in a very dramatic fashion. The second thing is this idea of regime destruction or decapitation. They can try that. That's been tried many, many times before. It's not going to work for the same reason that Nasrallah's assassination or Soleimani's assassination had no real demonstrative strategic impact. When you kill someone at the top or someone in any structure that is organized militarily or hierarchically, what do? You replace that individual with someone else. And in many cases, the individuals that show up next are frequently more radicalized and committed to the fight than the people that they're replacing. So that's a dangerous approach. It flies in the face of reason because historically, if you go to war, you try to go to war with the idea of ending the war as soon as possible and finding partners on the other side who recognize the wisdom of doing so as well. That is out of the question for the Israelis. They're taking a very Stalinist or Hitlerian approach. It's either everyone who opposes me is destroyed or annihilated, or it's unacceptable. In other words, it's a scorched earth approach that means that the end state is a world, as far as they are concerned, devoid of any enemies, and they are supremely powerful and in charge. That's it. And then finally, the nuclear facility issue. I'm sure that we have given them munitions that will allow them to penetrate. How far, how effectively, I have no idea. And they have redundant facilities. Not everything is necessarily concentrated in one location. So we'll have to see. But the real signal that all of this sends is you in Iran, you in every Muslim country, you in Turkey, you in China. And by the way, you Russians who are backing up the Iranians, you'd better figure out quickly that we're deadly serious. And if you get in our way, you're going to be victims too. I think it's a terrible way to do business because it's this sort of thing that says you're either with us or against us. When you take that position, inevitably, everybody ends up against you.
Right.
People you don't have to fight.
Now, I want to go down the task or the list here of those objectives and those things that they want to accomplish. And I'm going to ask you, do you think that they can physically do them in several different areas. But before I do that, and to put that in context, I want to mention something which you had actually sent me right prior to this show here about a development going on in Lebanon right now, which is very relevant to what we're talking about here. And that is this invasion that the Israelis have done into the southern part of Lebanon, where Hezbollah is, with the stated objective to move them back to the Litani River, about 25 kilometers deep, about 125 kilometers wide. That was a massive, massive military task all on its own. But coming on the heels of the fact that they still have combat power, they have to leave in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank to deal with what they're doing on those places. And at the same time, they're now about to start something bigger with Iran. They are suffering big time in the early effects of this war, where they're suffering strong casualties on like the first and second day. Can they sustain this in that area?
Well, if you're going to show the quote from Gallant, I'm sure you will, hopefully.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious that it's going to be difficult to do so. One of the things that the Israelis have been careful not to release are real accurate figures for casualties, killed and wounded. And remember, wounded falls into two categories: wounded so badly that you're out of action permanently, and then wounded in a way that means that you could return to duty at some future point. We have no idea what that looks like. But based upon what Gallant has said, it looks pretty grim right now, and they've only recently just crossed the border into Lebanon. And we heard that supposedly Israeli special operations forces were preceding the advancing troops in order to, quote unquote, clear the way so that this massive armored force and artillery force could be effective. Now, it's obviously not working out that way, but we don't know the details. Secondly, an Israeli soldier on the front in Lebanon was just interviewed on Israeli television within the last few hours. And one of his comments really stood out. He said, "I don't understand why people here continue to refer to this operation in Lebanon as limited." He said, "I've never seen so much equipment, so many stores, so much ammunition, so many fighting platforms. I've never seen anything in my life like this. It's overwhelming." I think he's telling us the truth. For the Israelis to go against Hezbollah, they always understood that if you go in there, you have to annihilate everybody that you come into contact with. In other words, it's a no quarter asked, no quarter given. Scorched earth operation, destroy everything. Because if you don't, it will be back. And they know that. Every time they've gone in and they have failed in that to achieve that objective, the enemy has grown stronger. So I think they've decided to take the gloves off. And the point is this: if you're sitting in Tehran, if you're sitting in Beirut, if you're sitting in Amman, in Cairo, anywhere else in the Muslim world, and you're looking at this, or Damascus, you need to understand something. This is real. This is exactly what Naftali said. They called it a once in a 50-year opportunity. I think it may turn out to be a once in the lifetime of Israel opportunity. The question is, how does that turn out? Does Israel emerge from this with the victory they want, which is the complete annihilation of all their enemies, or do they not emerge at all?
And I want to, one of our viewers there just ask a question there about what happens with reserves. And I wanted to ask that because according to, now this has not been corroborated because it's coming from the Lebanese media, but they're claiming that the first day casualties have been somewhere around 300 wounded Israelis. And again, to your point, who knows how serious those are, and 49 have been killed according to them. The Israeli Defense Forces, they're not, it doesn't appear to me, big enough to be able to keep something back in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, they're doing this massive organization here without calling up a lot of reservists. Do they have the force structure to even accomplish this objective?
Well, two things. First, we are pouring enormous amounts of cash and resources into Israel in order to keep Israel's economy from completely collapsing. So without us, none of this can happen simply because it's not a question of not having the manpower. They are literally harvesting most of the manpower right now, and they can't keep their economy running under these circumstances without us. Secondly, they seem to have added some new formations. Now, Americans need to understand that what we call a battalion which may be 500 to 800 to 1,000 men, depending upon the mission profile. A battalion in the Israeli setting is a brigade, and a brigade in the Israeli setting is not a brigade as we understand it. In other words, a battalion looks like a reinforced company, a brigade looks like a reinforced battalion, and a division is really a brigade-size organization of about 5,000. So we toss these terms around, and Americans think, oh man, that's 15, 20,000 troops in a division. No, it isn't. And the Israelis have organized this way so that they have a large leader to lead ratio. And the reason for that is very obvious. Most of these people are just citizens. They're citizens who have been put into uniform periodically, trained, and then go home as reservists, or the way our National Guards do. These people have taken a beating in Gaza. They're taking a beating now as they go into Lebanon, because they are not highly trained professional combat troops. They're going to do the best they can, but that's why Israeli air power is so important. That's why during the strike last night, the Iranians made a point of using their hypersonic missiles against those locations where Israeli air power is concentrated. Now, we don't know what the battle damage assessment was, and I don't think we'll know for a long time. And you know from your own experience in war, as I do, that BDA is always very misleading.
Yeah.
Last night we did this, or the 2 days this happened. It usually doesn't turn out to be accurate, and it's very misleading, and it creates a false impression of success. We saw that in the Gulf, and that was true during World War II. We're going to see it again here. And I think that's what's happening already as they move into Lebanon. It's hard for people who place so much value on technology and so little value on human capital, frankly.
Yes.
That to imagine that a well-trained opponent with reasonably good technology can do a lot of damage against someone who's not all that well-trained, despite hurling great quantities of explosives day and night on top of someone. So I think that's where we are right now. And it's going to be a tough fight.
Yeah, right. And that's why. So it's already a lot tougher at the barely scratched in the surface when they've started here to this objective they set of 25 kilometers times 125 wide. So if they're having that much difficulty right now on that, then let's go back to the strategic view, or at least the operational view. Can Israel make good on its objectives stated by Naftali Bennett, or whether it was Yoav Gallant or Netanyahu himself, that they're going to take out the leadership of Iran, and that they're going to take out their nuclear program? Can they do that?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult. So I'm not going to say they can't do it. I think it's probably unlikely that they will have as much success as they're anticipating. But remember, they also have us. And I think they're betting very heavily on us backstopping them. And remember that the things that you're describing happen against the backdrop of problems in Gaza, problems on the West Bank, problems in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, as well as what's going on in southern Lebanon. We know that thousands of additional, let us put it this way, Shiite fighters from Iraq, southern Arabia, Syria have also joined Hezbollah in this fight. So Hezbollah has actually been reinforced. How much, how effective is that? I don't know, but that's not inconsequential. Now, here's something else. Remember that they're also betting that we will continue to bribe the leadership in Arabia, in the Emirates, in Egypt and Jordan, because literally that's what we do. We have package deals that are offered involving billions of dollars that these various regimes desperately need to stay in power in order to feed their populations, pacify their populations, improve their infrastructure. What we don't know is how much longer that will work, because the populations are increasingly saying, we don't give a damn about that. And they're seeing the people that are leading their countries in the worst possible light. In other words, they conform to this ugly picture that's painted in the Quran of unworthy leaders, unworthy monarchs, unworthy sheikhs and emirs. So I have a feeling that a tipping point is coming. And Hezbollah is right now viewed in much of the Arab world and in the Muslim world in general as a heroic force, just as Hamas, simply by surviving and continuing to fight back, has become celebrated. How much longer does that go on before finally you do get Iran to step up 100%? And then there is always in the background Turkey. And the Turkish foreign minister has spoken about their unwillingness to stay out of the fight if this results in the destruction of Lebanon. And I think it's a fair argument right now that Lebanon is being destroyed.
Right. Yeah. Then that was another thing I wanted to talk about. But before, I'm going to ask you next. Let's assume that Israel does some version of what they said, whether it's tonight, the next night, somewhere soon. Then the next question is, what is Iran's likely counterstrike to that? Because it sounds like, listening to their president and their minister of defense last night, that they've already calculated what they're going to do next. But before I do, I want to show you what I think is a symptom of the Western thinking and what its absence is. I'm going to show you something from John Bolton. You, by saying that name, you already know pretty much what's going to follow. But here's what he's saying that we ought to do, which sounds like he got his talking points from Naftali Bennett.
This time, I do think there will be a very substantial response, whether it's against the Iranian Revolutionary Guard bases and headquarters, whether it's against their oil infrastructure on the Gulf, whether it's against the nuclear program. I don't know. I think any of those would be targets that would be perfectly legitimate for Israel to go after. And I think this time this is a demonstration for everybody, not just for the terrorist groups, but for Iran itself. They may not fear the United States. They do fear Israel, and they'll fear it more after this Israeli response.
So he's saying there, his viewpoint, and I see it, lots of people share it in the West, is that they say, yeah, you go, Israel, you hit them there, and that'll show them, and then they'll back down. There doesn't seem to be any thought to what happens next. So what do you think does happen next?
Well, I think, first of all, that what John Bolton described is precisely what the Israelis will do. And I don't think the Iranians will be surprised by it. I think they're prepared for it. And I think the same thing is true for Hezbollah, just as we've seen Hezbollah come to life rather dramatically and inflict heavy losses on advancing Israeli forces despite the pulverizing bombings and air attacks. You'll see the Iranians come back as well. The question is beyond the initial stage of destroy Iranian oil facilities, attack the Iranian government, its leadership, the decapitation idea, and then, of course, the nuclear facilities. What then? And I think what you've got to take into consideration is the possibility, very high probability, I think, that the entire region will explode. Because, again, the populations from Libya all the way to the border with Pakistan are all enraged. The entire Islamic world is enraged. People are pouring in to help and support and assist. But more important, the Russians and the Chinese, I would say even the Indians, although I don't see any evidence that they would engage directly. But everybody, the people that you referred to before as BRICS, which is a growing structure, the populations in those countries are all aligning against Israel and ultimately us. And this is why I've always wondered, once this really gets underway and the Israelis begin to take very serious losses simply because of overwhelming numbers, how much can we do to rescue Israel at that point? And then again, the question is, where do we go on the nuclear level? Because the use of a nuclear weapon by the Israelis would just do much more than turn them into a pariah in the world. It would also affect us, because no one has used that weapon in action since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So all I can say is John Bolton is correct in what he says is going to happen next. What happens beyond that will depend on the other factors that we've been discussing. And I think this is, I talked about Osavia, this notion of Islamist solidarity that cuts across national lines and boundaries. I think we're actually going to see that happen. but I think it's also going to be buttressed and supported by China and Russia.
So I want to look at that, because then that's where things start to get real messy. That could come in, and I think that the chance of that would go up a lot if the United States joins in, not with support, but actually fighting alongside Israel. Now, yesterday, I'm going to show you a clip here from Jake Sullivan, something that he was asked, and his choice of words here is interesting and possibly troubling. And I wonder how you interpret this. Watch this.
In April, after Iran struck Israel, the U.S. issued a number of sanctions as a consequence. This morning, the president said there would be severe consequences if Iran carried out this attack. What are those consequences, and are they more severe than sanctions?
Totally legitimate question, and that answer will come based on the conversations and consultations we have with our Israeli counterparts. It's too soon for me to stand before you today and give you an answer. What I can tell you is this. We are proud of the actions that we've taken alongside Israel to protect and defend Israel. We have made clear that there will be consequences, severe consequences for this attack, and we will work with Israel to make that the case.
So there will be severe consequences. We will work with Israel. That sounds like you're talking about joining in, not just giving them some more missiles. How do you read that?
Well, we're already involved. This is what people don't understand. We continue to deploy more and more forces to the region, but we're already involved. We have aircraft flying electronic intelligence missions. We're pinpointing targets, lasing targets for them. The only thing we haven't done is launch 1,000 fighter jets in support of them, and also launch the bombers that have already been pre-positioned in places like Diego Garcia to bomb for them. I think all of that is planned, and I suspect all of that will happen. And I think that the question is, does everyone in the world then suddenly bow down and beg forgiveness? I don't think so. I think the opposite is the case. I think we will see the wheels turn in directions that we wish would not move, and that is the world against us and Israel.
But now here's an additional question to that. It's one thing about just whether we do it and what the battlefield conditions would be like, but if the war in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, is any indication of what modern warfare is like, this is not something that's going to be like Desert Storm. It was over in 100 hours, or even the 2003 Operation Iraqi Freedom, which was about a month of ground combat, and then the war's over. This is something that would be a sustained combat. But can America engage in sustained combat? Just consider in the last 7 days, just within the last 7 days, the U.S. has given the largest ever arms and weapons package to Taiwan, in $567 million for Taiwan. Then $8 billion for Zelensky and Ukraine, and then $8.7 billion additional. This is new on top of what's already been given to Israel for its here. And we've already seen that we're short on interceptor missiles to give to Ukraine. Jake Sullivan admitted about 2 weeks ago that he's scraping them from everywhere else in the world that we've offered them so that we can have enough for there. And that's without us using anything. Do we have the capacity to sustain combat?
My short answer is probably not. Not if you have the Russians and the Chinese directly engage in support and potentially as co-belligerents. And that certainly is true if you add the Turks to the equation. So I would say no. But again, I'm sure that every conceivable effort imaginable is underway with regard to bribing people to stay out, with any number of different economic and financial benefits and packages. So I think that's underway. Will that work? And that's the real question. And I think as it becomes clear that what John Bolton predicts is happening, it will be harder for those countries' leaders who have historically simply taken the bribe and written off the issue to do so. To some extent, you might compare the beginning of this catastrophe to the outbreak of the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War begins at roughly 1618 and runs until 1648. It's not one long continuous war, it's a series, because not everyone becomes engaged immediately. it takes time for the various belligerents to make the decision to intervene, to organize themselves, and then fight. So I think you're in a similar situation right now where there are a number of people that are watching this that think they're going to have to fight. They don't want to, but they're increasingly convinced they'll have to. And it depends on our actions. And our actions, I think, as Jake Sullivan has made very clear, are continued unconditional support for whatever Mr. Netanyahu wants to do. And certainly John Bolton has given you a good snapshot of what they want to do to Iran. And I've tried to broaden that by saying what are the implications for the entire region and the Muslims that live in it. You put it all together, and I think that's going to have an enormous impact globally, not just regionally. And it's not going to help us or Israel in the long run in any way.
That headline that Gary's showing right there, apparently that's something that's new. It's today that Biden apparently opposes hitting Iran nuclear sites and wants it to be proportional, et cetera. The question is, how much influence does he actually have? I'm going to show you this clip from Biden in the immediate after this, and of course he's just reading off the talking points because I've heard this literal phrase from everybody that these attacks by Iran were defeated and ineffective. Watch him here.
Based on what we know now, the attack appears to have been defeated and ineffective. And this is testament to Israeli military capability and U.S. military. It's also a testament to intensive planning between the United States and Israel to anticipate and defend against the brazen attack we expected. Make no mistake, the United States is fully supportive of Israel. And I've been spent the morning and part of the afternoon in the Situation Room and meeting with my whole national security team and consulting with the Israelis indirectly because in terms of their impact on us. And the national security team has been, as I said, in constant contact with Israeli officials and their counterparts.
Now, there is an article out that I think it also came out yesterday. No, it was on the 30th in Politico. And in that article, there's a discussion that there was a lot of debate and discussion within the Biden administration about whether they should greenlight Israel's desire to go into southern Lebanon to fight Hezbollah. And apparently, Britt McGurk and one other official, I can't remember who it was right off the top, is reported to have worked with the Israelis and to get permission from that so that they could do it, and we would give them whatever support was needed. It was interesting, though, in that it said that within the administration, in the White House, in the Pentagon, and in the State Department, there were those who were against doing that because they apparently foresaw some of the problems that we're now seeing play out. In that the military task is so high for the Israeli Defense Forces that they can't succeed in that objective going up the Litani River without direct help. So they said, don't give that permission. Now, one wonders in the aftermath of that, if that's accurately reported, that now is Biden going, okay, hang on a second, because if the McGurk crew were wrong about how easy it was going to be in southern Lebanon, they may also be wrong about what happens if Israel hits Iran's nuclear sites. Do you see Biden having any possibility of telling Israel don't hit the nuclear sites or the make it proportional, or do you think that they're going to do whatever they want?
There's no evidence, contrary to whatever is claimed, that the administration has presented any obstacles to the Israelis in the course of executing whatever the Israelis want to execute. So I think that's ludicrous. Amos Hochstein and McGurk have both solidly represented and pushed Israeli interests at every turn. So I just think that's nonsense. We're 100% on board. Now, I'm not saying the American people are. I don't think the American people are aware that we are almost on autopilot right now in terms of flying into the storm that looks like a regional and then global conflict. No, I don't think Americans are remotely aware of it. And there's certainly no interest in the mainstream media or in Washington, as far as I can tell, to alert anybody to the ramifications of these actions. On the contrary, I think they believe that they're going to be able to pulverize everybody into submission. And if the Israelis can't do it on their own, we'll help them. And ultimately, everyone will be beaten into submission. I really believe that. I don't see any evidence for the rest of that. Now, just to break away for a second, in Tehran, there was a significant discussion, debate behind the scenes between what I would call the traditional hardliners and this new government, which has taken a decidedly moderate position vis-a-vis Israel and the United States. The new government won the argument, and that's why the strike was, in my judgment, strategically ineffective. Now, what happens next, especially if the Israelis do exactly what John Bolton has described, and I think they will, then the gloves will come off completely. And the Iranians will have no reservations or compunction about doing anything. And they will have a lot of support. And again, this is where the regional explosion is headed, and that explosion has global implications. No one is looking at that because people in Washington have this view that this is really 1991 and that we can pretty much do whatever we want. And our close friend Israel can do whatever it wants, and we'll back them all the way. I think that's really where people are, and there's nothing else to be said about it. You and I, all the rest of us, we're going to be bystanders at this disaster as it unfolds.
To your point, it's interesting you bring that up about the current Iranian government. There was an interview done with their vice president before this missile barrage struck, and he was explaining part of the reason why they were reserved in their responses to things that had happened so far, and the reason they did. And watch what he says here.
When Iran, with the new president, was opening a greater possibility for accommodation, for cooperation.
By the way, a new president who has said that he wants to have better relations with the United States.
With the rest of the world.
Including, but specifically he's mentioned the United States.
Yeah, yes. He said that he wants to at least de-escalate the situation with the United States.
And that is part of your, in principle, right? I mean, that's what your government now wants to do going forward.
Yeah, yes. But then they killed Hania on his inauguration day in order to block that. They've done that in the past. You remember when Biden was elected as president, Israel increased its operations in Iran, killing one of our nuclear scientists. So they thrive on tension, on conflict. And we will not provide it to them, but that doesn't mean that we will fail to defend our territory, fail to defend our people, and fail to defend our guests.
And that
their desire was to improve relations with the United States, but they said Israel blocked that at every case with concrete actions. That's not even an opinion. That's just an examination of the facts that have happened, many of which we're still seeing play out right now. So the question right now is we just heard Bolton and Ambassador Dannon at the beginning talk about what Israel is almost certainly going to do, or very likely to do, in their next barrage. If they do that, what do you think is Iran's next play?
Well, keep in mind, if you listen carefully to what the man said and what he was telling us is the truth, there's an underlying assumption that there is some daylight between Washington and Jerusalem on these matters. In other words, that you have two separate, distinct political entities with different views and different interests. And that simply isn't true. I would argue no one in Washington knows what our interests are. Our interests, if we sat down and tried to outline them strategically in a concrete way, would certainly not take us into a war with virtually the entire Muslim world that could spread and include most of the rest of the world. So, that just is not there. But the point is, he doesn't understand that there is no daylight there. By the way, I think it's important to understand that not only is there no daylight between Washington and Jerusalem, the puppet in Kiev, Zelensky, continues to speak for Washington. And even though Washington would like to wash its hand of the situation over there, and eventually will, the problem the Russians have always had is that they've wanted to believe that there were people in Washington anxious to bring the war to an end and negotiate with them. And frankly, that's just not been the case. And then finally, we have, as you mentioned, I think earlier in the program, The Chinese are discovering that we are continuing to bolster what we think are our interests in Taiwan. And we seem to think that we want Taiwan to become an unsinkable aircraft carrier for use by us and others against China. That's the way China views it, because that's the way it was used during World War II by the Imperial Japanese. So all in all, I think everyone who is wondering what really drives Washington has figured out that the desire to wage war and conflict with almost everybody that doesn't agree with us, that doesn't submit to us, particularly to our financial hegemony and economic dominance, as well as our military hegemony, is the enemy. And I think they're figuring it out. So when you ask, what will Iran do next? I think Iran will take the gloves off, and I think Iran will respond decisively. They have the capacity to fire 100 missiles an hour if they want to do it.
Yeah, and that would be well, that would certainly change the game here, and I think it's pretty predictable, at least initially, what kind of reaction that would get here, which I think is what Netanyahu plans. I think that he would. It seems to me, just looking at his actions, that he would be fine if we would just willingly join in with him and openly, so not even just even in the shadows, but just openly join in with him. But if not, I perceive that he is prepared for his troops in Lebanon to suffer a lot, and for his cities to get hit with this expected gloves off Iranian response, so that then they can cast themselves as, you can't abandon me now. Well, you know, our very state is at risk now. We need your help to come in. Or he could use his nuclear card. And in either way, that is just catastrophic for really for the world, but definitely for American interest. And it seems that at some point, and maybe this is just wishful thinking, that even those people who you just ably described about how they want to solve every problem with military can recognize that, okay, that's not going to help us out. So we need to put the brakes on something here pretty quick. Is there any chance that's going to happen?
Well, first of all, keep in mind that Mr. Netanyahu, whether you like him or not, is a very astute politician. And he understands that there is a critical prerequisite for success for him. And that is that the American population sleep comfortably at home without understanding what's happening beyond their borders. I think that people in Washington are equally sensitive to that. So what we don't know is what happens when we do commit all the air power that we've discussed and missile power. If that provokes a wider regional and particularly global response, you bring the Russians and the Chinese into the equation and others, then we've got a problem, because Americans haven't necessarily signed on for this. And it will be difficult for Americans to believe that all of this is quote unquote unprovoked. In other words, if they think they're going to pull off a quote unquote Pearl Harbor, I think they're misguided.
Well, you know, I guess we'll see, you know, how that turns out there. In the last few minutes that we have here, you've mentioned this a couple of times. I wonder if you could just kind of give an explanation for how you see the Russia connection going on with Iran specifically, because the Russian prime minister was there a couple of days ago. Actually, he was there hours before the first missile barrage came. And lots of talk about what's coming up with the BRICS meeting at Kazan here coming up shortly. What do you think would be the Russian reaction if this blows up into an all-out war between Israel and or the United States and Iran? Will Russia allow Iran to fall? Because it seems to me they need Iran.
The Russian point of view is very straightforward. They see Eurasia as emerging as a complex of enormous financial, economic, political, even cultural power. And if you go back to, let us say, the 10th century, and you look at the world then, the world consisted of China, India, Persia. Later on, you added to this the emerging Seljuk and then Ottoman empires and so forth. These concentrations are roaring back to strength and energy. The Russians have decided that their future lies in Central Asia and Asia in general. that their bet on the future is with China, India, Persia, Iran. These are enormous countries with great human capital, great resources, a great future. They have decided that they are unwanted by the West, and while they would like to go back at some point and do business with the West, they don't ever want to become dependent upon the West in the future again. So this is not just about does Russia support Iran? Is Russia going to remain faithful and true to the larger strategic vision that has been articulated not just in BRICS, but in the Shanghai Cooperation Council and in many, many other forums for a long period of time? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And we'll have to wait and see how all this plays out. It's just distressing to see, because the people in the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are paying a terrible price. The people in Lebanon, all of it, are paying a terrible price. The Israeli military is paying this awful price. And all of these games keep getting played, and you have the likes of Lindsey Graham and John Bolton, who don't seem to care anything about the human people that are involved in this, and they are almost always the bill payers for this. And for that, I just grieve. But
well,
that's
the nature of the ideologue. Remember, ideology is the secular variant of religion. So that's why I brought up the 30 Years' War and the outbreak of it, to try and get people to understand that this is exactly what you said. This is not likely to end quickly.
Yeah, I don't see any evidence of that here. We just can hope and pray that this doesn't at least escalate too big, however that's defined. But listen, we're going to stay on top of this. Thank you so much for coming on today, Doug. This is a great piece and really educating us on at least we understand what's going on. Thanks for coming on.
Sure, thank you.
And we appreciate you guys too. Always grateful to have you here watching us. Without you, we wouldn't even have a show. So thank you. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't. If you haven't done that already, we'd really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.